You said something in a conversation. Nothing dramatic, just a comment, an opinion, maybe a small attempt at humor that didn't quite land the way you intended. The moment passed. The conversation moved on. Nobody mentioned it again. But you did. On the way home, or later that evening, or in that quiet stretch before sleep, you went back to it. Replayed it. Heard yourself say it again and winced slightly. Wondered why you said it that way. Thought of 3 better ways you could have said it. Considered whether the other person noticed. Decided they probably did. Wondered what they thought. Concluded it probably wasn't good. The moment itself was small. Forgettable by any reasonable measure. But the voice that returned to it was not interested in reasonable measures. It had its own standard, precise, ungenerous, and entirely certain of itself, and by that standard, you had fallen short. Not badly. Not catastrophically. Just enough to deserve a revisit. Just enough to be worth mentioning. This is the inner critic. Not a dramatic presence. Not a voice that shouts or accuses loudly. It is quieter than that and, because of its quietness, harder to argue with. It sounds measured. It sounds honest. It presents itself not as cruelty but as accuracy, as the part of you that simply sees things clearly and is willing to say so. And it is always there. Not always loud, but always present. Watching the conversation before it ends. Reviewing the email before it is sent. Sitting quietly in the background of ordinary moments, waiting for the small gap between what happened and what it believes should have happened. It doesn't need a big mistake to find something to work with. A slightly wrong word. A moment of hesitation. A laugh that came out louder than intended. A pause where there should have been confidence. Anything is enough. Because the inner critic is not really responding to what happened. It is responding to the distance between what happened and its own idea of how things should have gone. And that distance, in the inner critic's eyes, is always worth noting. Always worth returning to. Always worth one more quiet, precise, entirely convincing look. It never grows tired of looking. It never decides that enough has been said. It simply waits for the next moment, and the one after that, measuring each one against a standard it never quite explains and never puts down. Most people learn to live alongside it. They stop noticing how often it speaks because its voice has become so familiar it no longer sounds like a voice at all. It sounds like the truth. Carl Jung believed that everything we reject about ourselves goes somewhere. It doesn't disappear. It doesn't dissolve quietly with time. It moves inward, into the part of the psyche Jung called the shadow, that accumulation of traits, impulses, and beliefs about ourselves that we found too uncomfortable to carry openly. And there it stays, waiting, shaping behavior in ways we rarely trace back to it. Jung noticed something important about the inner critic. He saw it not as an outside force that had somehow gotten in, but as something built from the inside, constructed carefully, over years, from every moment a person learned that certain parts of themselves were not acceptable. The child who was told to be quieter. The person who was praised only when they performed well. The individual who absorbed, slowly and without realizing it, the message that love and approval were things to be earned rather than simply received. The inner critic is the voice that learned those lessons and never stopped applying them. It took the standards of the outside world, the expectations of parents, teachers, peers, culture, and made them internal, permanent, self-governing, so that eventually no outside voice was needed at all. The person began doing the work themselves, measuring and correcting and finding fault with a precision that no external critic could match, because no external critic knows them quite as well. Jung would have pointed to the shadow here with particular care. Because the inner critic doesn't only attack what we do wrong. It often attacks most fiercely the parts of us that are closest to what we secretly want to be. The person who longs to be creative but tears apart everything they make. The person who wants to speak honestly but replays every word they said until it sounds wrong. The shadow carries not just our darkness but our unlived potential, and the inner critic, Jung believed, is often the voice that keeps that potential exactly where it is. Unnamed. Unexpressed. Safe from the risk of being seen and found wanting. What makes this so difficult to recognize is that the inner critic sounds like self-awareness. It sounds like the honest, clear-eyed part of you that refuses to let things slide. Jung understood that this is precisely what makes it so effective. It has borrowed the language of reflection and turned it into something else entirely, not a tool for growth, but a mechanism for keeping the self small, contained, and permanently under review. The division Jung described is not between good and bad. It is between the self that wants to move forward and the part that was taught, long ago, that moving forward was never entirely safe. Friedrich Nietzsche understood ambition. He understood what it feels like to hold a high image of yourself, not out of arrogance, but out of genuine care for what you are capable of becoming. He wrote about the drive to grow, to push, to refuse mediocrity. But he also understood, with uncomfortable clarity, what happens when that drive turns inward and becomes a tribunal. When the part of you that wanted to be better becomes the part of you that punishes you for not being there yet. Nietzsche wrote about values, not the values handed down by society or religion, but the ones a person builds for themselves. The private standards that govern what feels acceptable, what feels like enough, what feels worthy of respect. These values, when they are genuinely a person's own, can be a source of real strength. They give direction and they create meaning. But Nietzsche was also honest about what happens when those values become detached from compassion, when they stop being a guide and start being a sentence. The inner critic, seen through Nietzsche's lens, is what happens when a person's ideals become weapons turned against themselves. The standard was built from something real, a genuine desire to be thoughtful, capable, honest, good. But somewhere along the way the standard stopped serving the person and started judging them. And unlike an outside judge, this one has no mercy built in. It does not account for tiredness, or difficulty, or the ordinary limitations of being human. It simply holds up the image of what you should be and measures the distance between that and what you are. Nietzsche would have recognized something particularly painful about the inner critic, that it is loudest in the people who care the most. The person who never thinks about whether they are doing well rarely hears it. It is the person with genuine standards, genuine ambition, genuine investment in their own character, who gives the inner critic its sharpest edge. Because they have built something worth measuring against. And so the measuring never stops. He would have called this a betrayal of the self. Not because standards are wrong, but because a standard that only punishes and never acknowledges is no longer serving growth. It is serving something else, a kind of permanent dissatisfaction that keeps the person striving without ever allowing them to arrive. Always falling short, always one revision away from good enough, always hearing the voice that looks at what was done and finds, quietly and precisely, the thing that wasn't quite right. Nietzsche believed a person should be their own creator. But the inner critic, he would have said, is what happens when the creator becomes the critic, and forgets how to be anything else. Albert Camus spent his life thinking about the gap between what human beings want and what the world actually gives them. He called this gap the absurd, the collision between a person's deep need for clarity, meaning, and approval, and the world's complete indifference to providing any of it. But Camus noticed that this collision doesn't only happen between a person and the world outside. It happens inside the person too. Between who they are and who they believe they should be. Between what they did and what they feel they should have done. Between the life being lived and the life the inner voice insists should have been lived instead. Camus understood exhaustion in a very specific way. Not the tiredness that comes from working hard or sleeping badly, but the deeper tiredness that comes from holding yourself to a standard that was never designed to be met. The inner critic, in Camus' world, is the voice that keeps presenting the ideal, the perfect version of the conversation, the decision, the response, the self, and then measuring every real, imperfect, human moment against it. And because the ideal is always cleaner than reality, reality always loses. Every time, without exception. What Camus would have pointed to is the image itself. The inner critic needs something to measure against, and that something is always a fiction, a version of you that never hesitated, never said the wrong thing, never fell short of its own expectations. This imagined self is the standard. And it is an impossible standard, not because you are failing, but because it was constructed outside the conditions of real life. It was built without tiredness, without uncertainty, without the ordinary difficulty of being a person moving through an unpredictable world. Camus believed that the honest response to the absurd was not to pretend the gap doesn't exist, and not to collapse under it, but to see it clearly and keep moving anyway. He called this revolt, not a dramatic rebellion, but a quiet refusal to be destroyed by the distance between the real and the ideal. To acknowledge that the gap is there, that it will always be there, and to live fully in spite of it. The inner critic survives on the belief that the gap is a problem to be solved. That if you just review things carefully enough, correct yourself precisely enough, hold yourself to account firmly enough, eventually the ideal and the real will meet. Camus would have said, gently but honestly, that they won't. That the voice which never approves is waiting for a version of you that doesn't exist. And that the most human thing you can do is notice that, and keep going anyway. Not because you have silenced the voice, but because you have decided, quietly and without drama, that it no longer gets the final word.